our efforts. Another area that I have interest in is science. That is, we're looking at solar energy and biotechnology basic research. We should increase our investment in this area as a form of making a contribution to the international community. Science that enable mankind to make advances and have allowed us to expand our area of activities from the Earth to the outer space. But when we look back on the Earth from the outer space, we note that this world, this beautiful planet of ours, is the one and only home for all of us. Each and every one of us have the obligation to hand down this beautiful and abundant earth to our future generations. From this perspective, in the future, Japan needs to base itself on the idea of being in the same boat and helping each other. If a large elephant was to get into a small boat, the boat would capsize and all of us would drown. Both mankind and the international community needs to heighten our awareness as to the difficulties that we're facing and the urgency of these problems. 10 years ago, at New York's Plaza Hotel, the G5 summit was held, during which time agreement was reached regarding the idea of making concerted efforts to coordinate our macroeconomic policies and correct the strong yen. This agreement was possible because there was a strong sense that we were in the same boat and that we needed to help each other. Mr. Baker and other members of other nations who made the Plaza Accord possible, I share pride in knowing that we all work towards the same goal, and these are the people I trust and whose friendships I value to this day. However, times have changed, and the paper money society has matured, and we need to start exploring new directions. This is undeniable. And the forum for us to explore these issues, I believe, would be the IMF, for example. As far as conflict that existed between the East and the West based on ideology has come to an end, China, with a population of 1.2 billion people, and Russia, with 150 million people, they have joined the free economies, and this is something that we truly welcome. Every time I visit China, I'm also often struck by the remarkable progress that has been made in China. Having said this, from this time onwards, rather than concentrating on rapid growth, I believe what is necessary is to concentrate on steady, wholesome growth and development of the economy. In the long term, this would bring a greater payoff, I believe. As far as these matters are concerned, when I speak with the leaders of China, Chairman Jiang Zemin and Premier Li Peng, I speak to them about these matters, and I speak to them from my experience. Not only in Russia, or rather not only in China, in Russia and other countries of the former Soviet Union, it is important for us to be patient with these countries and provide support in a manner that would be suitable to their respective situations. Whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish, tolerance, or rather endurance, is important. This is known as a helpful guideline in both the West and the East. We need to learn, act, look back on what we have done, learn our lessons, and move on. In any event, there's no progress in conflict and struggle. Promise of a bright future is possible where there is dialogue and cooperation. May you continue your excellent work, be happy, and prosper. This concludes my remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would like to call on the former Foreign Minister of the Soviet Union, Mr. Besmertnik.
I understand that my task is to describe what is happening in Russia within 7 minutes. I think the task is almost impossible, like modernizing Russia in 7 years.
So I should take an extra minute.
Thank you. One of the problems that we all have when we discuss the situation in my country is that there are so many views of what is happening there, on what is happening there. There are so many conclusions, very often conflicting, and that creates a situation when the reality is blurred, and people outside and inside Russia do not really understand what is happening to them and to Russian economy in the first place. And in this pretty ambiguous situation, the question started to be asked whether the whole idea was sound enough, whether a reform should have been started, might have been better not to do it at all, just to survive the way it was before. I think that the majority of Russians, whatever is the pain and suffering, start to realize that the reforming of the country was an absolutely necessary thing. It was an unavoidable phenomenon, and it happened at the right time, but maybe not exactly the right way. I would believe that anyone who would come to power in 1985 would start reforming Russia both politically and economically. But the fate decided that it was Gorbachev who had to do it. So the task fell on his shoulders, and he started to reform Russia basically in a political way. He believed that economic reform would wait for a while. He chose a very soft, delicate way of handling the situation. Yeltsin himself and the group of people who came with him, they chose to act aggressively and directly, dealing primarily with the economic situation. The emphasis was on economy, and they believed that the political part would wait for a while. But the reforms, both political and economic, started to jump on the leaders, pushing them to the directions which they might not have chosen themselves if were not kicked by all those demands on them. So the reforms, both economic and political, as I said, were completely unavoidable. The fundamental reason for that was that the society, traditional industrial society in the Soviet Union, was doomed. It was in the deepest of crises, because that society was based on high level of militarization, on high level of energy wasting, and on low level of consumer standards. So we started the reform. There was a lot of things done which were very unpopular with the Russian people, especially the program of liberalization, which just turned the millions of people into the poor ones right overnight. When Gaidar liberalized the prices, all the savings of the people were destroyed just overnight, and that basically closed the political future of Gaidar. But that was a necessary step. It might have been done somewhat more delicately, but it was a necessary element of the reforms, because we had a huge ruble overhang sitting there, accumulated for years before the reforms and depressing the economy. So we had to remove that ruble overhang so that the reformist forces could start working. Since I have 8 minutes for the description, now I would like just to be very laconic about the figures. But I agree with what Secretary Baker just said in his speech. The economic reform has brought already a lot of positive results, and that's true. We have now approached a moment when we can say that reform is winning, economic reform is winning. We have started to terminate the constant decline of industrial production. As you may know, we have lost the industrial production for the years of 1992-1995. We have lost 50% of industrial production. During the Great Depression of the United States in the 30s, the United States lost 31% of the production within a short period of time. So we have lost 50. Until the last moment, till this year, we didn't see any signs of stopping that decline. And at last, by the fall of this year, we see that probably by the beginning of 1996, we shall have a zero decline of industrial production. And we even predict a slow increase in it of about 1 or 1.5% in 1996. A very small but very important indication of the turn in economic life for the positive. We have actually got over the inflation in Russia as compared with what was happening for the last, say, 2 or 3 years. The inflation now is about 2% of the GDP of the country. And we have solved one of the troublesome problems for any nation, for any government, maybe temporarily only, the problem of the budget deficit. So the budget deficit is going down, and that will probably give us a chance to start the new upsurge of the economy within the next 1 or 2 years. So what kind of directions the further developments may take? There are probably 3 possible alternative ways for the future of Russia in the economic area. First is the so-called depressive rotting period, when the economy will go on rotting for several more years to go, and that will happen if the annual production will not go over 1%, 1.5%. The difference is negligible, and inflation would stay at about 8 to 12%. Second alternative way I would call a moderate renewal or moderate renaissance of the Russian economy, and that would happen if we would raise the production to 5 or 6% annual rate, and inflation would stay at the level of, say, 3 or 4%. And optimistic optimistic alternative would be achieved if the production would go up to 10 or 12% of annual rate, and the inflation would get down to say 1%. I personally believe that we may probably be able to stick to the second alternative of moderate renewal. But in order to do that, we need a national strategy of economic development for the next 10 years. The problem with Russian economic reform is that we do not have a strategy except some general ideas about going to the market economy and going to democratic economic reconstruction. It's not enough. We need a better blueprint for the further development, and if we don't do it, we may slip again to a chaotic situation in the economic area in the country. Since we are talking about the challenges for the foreign policy at the end of this century, beginning of the next one, I think one of the basic elements of the global strategy would be to have its own view of what the world could do about Russia. I think Russia should not be allowed to go isolationist. There is a danger of it, not because of a design, but just because of the circumstances. So I think that if the outside world wants Russia to be the part of the development of the 21st century, there should be a global strategy of viewing the Russian developments, of seeing it as the part of their own development. Since Secretary Berker very correctly mentioned that we live in the time of globalization. 2 things, maybe, just to add to what I wanted to say, in a particular way. What the outside world should do to help Russia in a general way. I'm not talking about financial help, giving some more money or something. First of all, the United States, the West, should do everything to help to develop the small and medium-sized business in Russia. You know, I think the support is kind of misplaced. The support goes to the government, which is good, and to some large industrial corporations. But market economy, and you know it better than anyone else, is based on the development of small and medium-sized businesses. We can have hundreds and hundreds of Gaidars and Yavlinsky walking in the Kremlin corridor, and if there is no one to work on the ground, then nothing will happen. So, and now we don't have a single dollar or a single cent received by small businessmen in Russia, although there are a lot of administrations handling that business both in the United States and in Russia. And the second point I would like to say is to be a little bit more tolerant to the Russian specifics, especially in the relationship between the society and the government, or the role of the state. Traditionally, Russia was based on the strong role of the state in economic and political affairs. We didn't have a civil society before, and when you now look at Russian situation and say the government, the state should not play a role in Russian economic development, that means that Russia will not be able to do anything that it should do. And the third point, I think the outside world should be very careful about the necessity to support democracy in Russia. I believe, unfortunately, there are some signs that some of the people in the West would rather stick to the stability in Russia than democracy in Russia. And as you know, stability may be achieved and just by non-democratic ways. I think I'll stop there. And thank you very much, Marian, for giving me an extra minute again.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Our final presenter is Ambassador Chu. Sir.
Mr. Chairman, I wish to begin by expressing my thanks to the Baker Public Policy Research Institute for its kind invitation, which gives me the opportunity of coming back to the beautiful city of Houston to meet with my friends, old and new, and attend this important conference on diplomatic challenges by the end of the century. As you all know, reform in China started in 1979. The year 1992 marked a new stage of China's reform. The prominent hallmark of this new stage is a proposed goal of building a socialist market economy. In such an economy, economic activities are regulated by the market forces and law of value within the framework of the socialist system. Over the past 3 years and more, and particularly in the last year, we have introduced a series of major reform measures in such areas as the transformation of operational mechanism of state enterprises, banking, taxation, foreign exchange, foreign trade, investment, pricing, circulation, and market system. We have thus taken a crucial step forward and made significant progress in our efforts to establish the socialist market economy. China's reform efforts over the years have brought about huge and profound changes to its economic system. First, in terms of ownership, the unitary structure of public ownership has given way to a new one. Under the new structure, the state, collective, individual, private, and overseas funded economic sectors coexist with the public sector playing a dominant role. The various economic sectors compete with each other on an equal footing and seek common development. Second, with the deepening of enterprise reform, China's state-owned enterprises are gradually becoming independent legal entities, a subject of market competition. Third, a commodity market setup has taken shape in China, and the market of production factors has also expanded tremendously. market is playing an ever bigger role in the allocation of resources. Fourth, in terms of macro control mechanism, the management of the economy, mainly through direct administrative control, is gradually giving way to that mainly through indirect regulatory measures using comprehensively economic levels and legal means. Fifth, in terms of distribution, a system has basically been put in place in which pay according to one's work is the main form, supplemented by other modes of distribution. While deepening the reform, we are also expanding our opening up program step by step. Since the beginning of 1990s, we have extended our open areas from coast to inland. Now over 1,100 cities and counties across the country are open to the outside world. There has emerged a new multi-level or directional multi-form opening up pattern extending from coast to the inland. With the adoption of the policy of reform and opening to the outside world, historic changes have taken place in China's society and economy in the past 17 years. Its GNP grew 3.3 times between 1979 and 1994, representing an average annual growth rate of 9.8%. China's foreign trade has expanded rapidly. In 1994, the total trade volume reached almost $240 billion. That is 11.5 times that of 1978, registering an average annual growth rate of 16.5%. Our foreign currency reserve has reached $70 billion. Since 1990, more than $100 billion of direct foreign investment have poured in. Now China's economy is maintaining a healthy momentum of development. The proposal for formulating the ninth five-year plan for national economic development and social progress from 1996 to the year 2000, and the long-term objective for the year 2010, which was recently adopted, has laid out the blueprint for our reform and development into the next century. We will quadruple the 1980 per capita GNP in the year 2000, despite a population increase of some 300 million, thus basically eliminating poverty and providing a fairly comfortable life to the people. In another decade, leading to the year 2010, we will double our GNP of the year 2000, and our people will become more affluent and our socialist market economy more perfected. In short, with our hard work in the next 15 years, China's social productive forces aggregate national strength and quality of the people's lives will be raised to a new level. Market progress will also be made in the development of socialist culture, ideology, democracy, and legal system. This will lay a solid foundation for achieving the basic modernization by the middle of next century. Ladies and gentlemen, for some time now, we have heard unrealistic assessments on the conditions in China from the mass media in the West. Some people are pessimistic about the development prospect in China on the grounds of ongoing inflation, the widening gap between the rich and the poor, political instability, a huge population, and limitations in agricultural development to support it. Indeed, China has come across some problems in the course of its economic development, but these are the kind of problems that would crop up during the progress of development. In the course of that settlement, our economy is revitalized and developed. It goes without saying The agricultural development is in such a populous country like China is an issue calling for our constant attention. And inflation is also a problem we have to, to find means to resolve it. The good news is last year the inflation rate was 12.7%. This year we expect that the inflation rate will be reduced to 15%. So we are confident that we will be able to overcome the difficulties on the way ahead, and we are convinced that the encouraging system of economic growth, political stability, national unity, and social progress will continue to prevail in China for long. On the other hand, some other people have taken China as the third largest economy in the world on the ground of its economic growth. They have obviously overestimated China's economic strength. In fact, China is still a low-income developing country. The various benchmarks are still quite low if calculated on a per capita basis. It will take the efforts of several generations for China to reach the level of average developed countries. Still, some others in the West allege that China will become a threat to other countries when it is developed and powerful. Some have even openly advocated for containment against China. This allegation is utterly groundless and dangerous. In fact, the economic development and improvement of China's livelihood for the 1.2 billion people are China's share of contribution to world peace, stability, and development. An underdeveloped China, with its people in poverty, would really constitute a threat to world peace and development. In its modern history, the Chinese nation suffered a lot from the aggression, oppression, and plunder by major foreign powers for well over a century. It has never invaded or threatened any country. Because of our own historical experience, we greatly cherish the hard-won independence and freedom. We never interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, nor will we do so when China is developed and powerful in future. The so-called China threat is nothing but an absurd argument to intimidate people. And ladies and gentlemen, the world economy is becoming more and more integrated. The sustained development of Chinese economy and the success of our reform cannot be achieved without international cooperation and a stable, peaceful international environment. We will continue to open up the domestic market, gradually grant national treatment to overseas funded enterprises, and administer them according to law with a view to protecting the legitimate rights of both Chinese and overseas investors. We will step up economic legislation, establish and then constantly improve the legal system in line with the new economic structure. We will, together with other countries, actively seek the establishment of a peaceful and stable international environment so as to further develop our respective national economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for that presentation. And now that we have laid out the three positions, I'm going to call upon the 7 members of the rest of the panel to give their own perspective on this particular problem. And before we start, I wanted to share a secret with you. The man to my right, Ed Deregian, the director of the Baker Institute, once used to deal with the press on a regular basis. I don't want you to hold that against him. He was an excellent spokesman, both at the State Department and at the White House, and then went on to a very distinguished career in the rest of diplomacy as well, and now is running a wonderful institute here, and I hope that we'll be able to work together very, very closely in the future. Ed, and it's nice to have you to my right as we figure out what is going to happen now. Professor Smith, why don't you start and give us your judgment, sir?
Caught me with some water, I'm sorry.
Yeah, when you finish.
Fine. Well, I appreciate Ambassador Zhu's discussion, and I would like to pick up on some themes. It's quite clear, as all of you know, and with the presentation from Ambassador Zhu, that China's economic development has been remarkable over the past 10 years. A growth of 10% or so a year is really quite remarkable. It has opened up commercialization in virtually every realm of Chinese society. Even the People's Liberation Army has become involved in commercial enterprises ranging from hotels to foreign trade to food production. Among other things, I think this bodes quite well for the sustained momentum of the economic changes when vested interests such as the PLA are involved. This strikes me as something that suggests the continuity of these very important reforms. These changes have also introduced tremendously important political and cultural changes. I'm struck that my own paper for this conference stands midway between economics and culture. One of the things that I really have been struck by over time is the greater freedom that these economic reforms and the open policy have entailed. That is to say, from one perspective, we can look at China and see certainly problems in the realms of freedom, problems in various areas of human rights. These have been well rehearsed, and I see no reason to speak more about them. On the other hand, what I'm struck by is that in many ways, and having been to China virtually every year for many years since the 1970s, I'm struck that in many important ways, China is a freer society today than it has ever been since liberation in 1949. This is not to say that there aren't problems that remain, but this kind of freedom, this accessibility to information through the print media, through a proliferation of electronic media and so forth, including now the internet, has opened China up in quite remarkable ways. I think there's also greater physical and social mobility in China, and certainly a greater range of intellectual and cultural options. So despite the constraints that we might have heard about in the aftermath of events in 1989, I would still argue that intellectuals have a far greater range of intellectual possibilities that are open to them, and these intellectual possibilities, of course, have political implications. There are also, of course, a great number of influences that have penetrated China from the United States and also from environments such as Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Korea, and Japan. And these too have broadened the base of both political and social and cultural discussions. But these changes have also brought with them certainly problems of considerable magnitude. One of the most important of these, I think, in its political dimension is the question of regionalism. That is to say, in the southeastern part of China in particular, change has proceeded at a much greater rate and with much more profound implications than it has in other parts of China. So if we compare, for example, peasant income in the realm, let's say, of southeast China, provinces such as Guangdong, Fujian, and so forth, Shanghai, in Jiangsu province, we see tremendous disparities between the income of peasants and, in fact, urban workers and places in the Northwest. And so these kinds of regional disparities create very great tensions in terms of the allocation of resources. And I think this is a theme that we must really keep into account when we think about the possibilities for China's development in the 21st century. Secondly, there has been clearly a loss of state and party control over these areas. The percentage of state revenue derived from gross domestic product has declined over time. The state has been, in other words, unable to command the same degree of resources from southern areas in particular that it has in the past, and these too have important implications for policy. The income disparities, I might add, have also given rise to profound peasant dissatisfaction in several parts of China, which have manifested themselves in peasant uprisings, for example, in the hundreds. So this too is a political problem of some significance. Also, in these regional areas, there's been an assertion of regional pride, the assertion of regional dialects, regional practices. Particularly in South China, the clan system has reasserted itself with a vengeance, and one of the implications of this has been a growth in clan warfare, which again gives great pause to the state authorities. Finally, of course, in terms of this set of problems, there has been the rise of corruption. And this corruption problem, of course, gives great pause to the state authorities. It does have a certain regional dimension and needs certainly to be brought under control. And finally, there is a crisis of culture in China. And again, my colleague Benjamin Lee in the third session will address this more fully. But Chinese intellectuals, particularly with the decline in the aura of the party, are searching for a new source of inspiration, a new source of spirituality, perhaps even a new sense of religious possibility. And these things, too, are of grave concern to the state government. As a result, we've had a series of campaigns directed against what has sometimes been called bourgeois liberalization, or in fact, spiritual pollution. And these campaigns have been designed to redirect China's spiritual orientation, in a sense. And so these kinds of problems are very, very serious. And I think the most serious of all of these problems is the way in which regionalism and a kind of greater division within the body politic has created separatist kinds of sentiments. And the state fears these above all. And because of these fears, we find, for example, that questions of Tibet, questions of Taiwan are very closely linked with American policy. That is to say, the Chinese consider some of these policies to be a question of American policy. I'll have to end on this note, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Sir Charles, Chris Wisdom from London.
Well, thank you very much. I thought if we were going to give time on a population basis, I would probably qualify for about 41 seconds. But just a few comments on what's been said so far, both on Russia and on China. I think the first question I asked on Russia is whether we can yet judge economic reform as a success or a failure. And you have to say, really, compared with what? Compared with what's going on in the Asia-Pacific, it's not very impressive. Compared even with what's going on in some of the more developed economies of Central Europe, it's not that good. But of course, what you have to compare it with is the situation left with the collapse of the old Soviet Union. And I think if you measure the progress of the last 5 years against that standard, then to adopt a phrase of President Reagan's, the Russian performance is not bad at all. You see, they didn't have to get just from the old central planning system to something new. The reforms of the Gorbachev era, in my mind, made things actually rather worse, because they left the old system in place, but they crippled its ability to deliver what it was delivering. Not very much, perhaps, but it was delivering some quite slender benefits. Now, it's sometimes said the reforms themselves have caused economic instability in Russia because they've been too much shock therapy. Personally, I disagree with that. I think, on the whole, the reforms were too half-hearted and too drawn out with too many half measures, and thus extended the pain. And above all, of course, they failed to deal radically enough with the high inflation, which has been at the core of many of Russia's problems. On the other hand, we certainly cannot wash our hands of it. I think part of the failure was ours in the West. When a comprehensive stabilization program was announced in Russia in 1992, I think it was based on the belief, on the expectation that substantial foreign aid would be forthcoming that year. But most of it never materialized. You know, I remember in the old Soviet Union, people used to say about the government, they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. Well, I think in this case, it was the West pretended to aid Russia, while the Russian government pretended to stabilize the economy. But you know, I think if you look at the record, year by year, it is not bad. Many of the legacies of the old Soviet system have actually gone. In 1992, there was price liberalization. 1993 saw the end of the ruble zone, and it saw the end of the old Soviet constitution. And that was a very important step, because it was only then that the central bank, for the first time, aligned itself properly with the anti-inflation policy of the government. And then in 1994, you saw the end of the first phase of privatization, probably one of the most extensive privatization programs ever undertaken. And this year, we've seen foreign trade liberalization, and the adoption of an anti-inflationary budget. Now, certainly the problems aren't over. I think the weakness of the state is a problem. Clearly, only a very small proportion of GNP is being collected in tax revenue. I think if you measured the real economy, I should think the tax take is as low as 5%. I think even the official figure is only 10%. And there's criminality. But I think even despite that, one would say that the transition to a market economy has been made. I'm always impressed by Prime Minister Klaus of the Czech Republic's definition of whether a country has made the transition to being a functioning capitalist economy. And he defines it as the enactment of a critical mass of reforms needed to change the basic system and deliver tangible benefits. And I think by that yardstick, I think you could say that Russia has become a market economy. If I could just make 2 or 3 very brief comments on China and the very interesting remarks we had from Ambassador Zhu. I think that there are really 4 questions. The first one is, can the economic reform process now be reversed? My answer is firmly that it cannot possibly be so. It is so entrenched now. And although reform causes problems, the only way to solve those problems is more reform. So, I mean, the recipe for dealing with the problems of success is simply to have more success. And I think that is what we shall see. Secondly, can we define China as a market economy? Well, Ambassador Chu described it, I think, as a socialist market economy. There used to be a phrase, socialism with Chinese characteristics, and I think most of us would now say the Chinese characteristics are winning hands down, and thank goodness for that. In practice, the Chinese economy seems to me, as somebody who does quite a lot of business with China, to be divided into 2 parts. There's the old communist part of the economy and the modern, increasingly private sector part. And basically, the private sector part is paying for the old communist part. How long that can last, I don't know, but I believe that particularly after 1997, when Hong Kong comes aboard, as it were, when China resumes sovereignty over Hong Kong, it will increase the pace of reform. It will make China more and more a market economy. One does have to remember an extraordinary fact that with only 6 million people, Hong Kong's GNP is equivalent to 26% of China's GNP. And the accretion of that great economic wealth, based on probably the most free market capitalism that anyone's ever devised anywhere, is going to have an enormous influence. Thirdly, what are the political consequences of all this change in China? I mean, I think if you go through history, it's very hard indeed to find an example of a country which has gone through so much and such sweeping economic change as China has in the last few years, without quite extensive political change following it. It may be sooner, it may be later. It's not particularly our business, it's China's own business when it happens. But I find it hard to believe myself that in 20 years' time, China will be a vibrant economic giant full of educated, mobile, affluent people who will be content to live under the present political system. Lastly, what is the right policy for us? Well, I'm absolutely sure that the right policy is one of engagement. It is of drawing China, integrating it as far as possible into the world economy. That, of course, is very much a two-way process. It's good for China, but it also carries obligations for China, some of them really quite demanding. I was reading this morning in the Wall Street Journal that Chinese tariffs on average are still about 40%. Now, Ambassador Chu made the very valid point that despite the stories you sometimes hear that the streets of Beijing and Shanghai are paved with gold, actually there is still a very long way to go. But nonetheless, the way China trades with the rest of the world will have to be changed, but it must be the right way to go. Whether politically or economically, engagement must be the right answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Crisply, I hope we shall move along. Mr. Parsky.
Thank you very much. Often the State Department allocated that amount of time to the Treasury Department when I was there. But fortunately, we have a representative of both departments that leads this conference, Jim. Just a few comments I'd like to make. Generally, from at least my perspective, I think economic reforms have obviously occurred in both Russia and China. But as a general comment, I would make is that in Russia, the political change, at least a commitment to that change, has accompanied the economic changes. In China, the political change, at least from my perspective, has not paralleled the economic reforms or change. I believe in both cultures, economic reform is irreversible, in part because I believe it's in the self-interest of both cultures for this change. However, unless the political reforms continue in Russia, in part with our help, and unless political reforms in China catch up, I think the road will be somewhat rocky, and I think reversals could occur, which we as a government, I think, should be prepared for. Just a few comments generally about Russia. I think it's important to define what economic reform means. If you focus, I think, on such questions as, is there a fair distribution of wealth or resources? Or is there increased criminal activity? Or is there the efficient delivery of services? Then perhaps you would conclude that there hasn't been much reform, certainly not by US standards. But I think these are somewhat the consequences of reform, rather than the reform itself. So I would suggest that we focus on a few different types of issues in asking the question of whether reform has taken place and is. For instance, is investment coming in to the country? Are property rights improving? On both of these fronts, I think we can say significant reform has occurred. When I was in the Treasury Department in 1974, we helped work on what was then referred to as a US-Soviet Commission on Trade and Economic Policy. And visiting the then Soviet Union in 1974, I think despite a desire to develop stronger economic ties and trade with us, decisions about the deployment of capital were all centralized. And if governments make such decisions, I think history shows us that the rates of return on investment go down, that employment is down, and that productivity is down. So I think if you really focus on that kind of change, on where decisions on the allocation of capital are being made, I think you can see some very positive developments. Now, 21 years later, who's making the capital decisions? I think there's no question that it is being made more and more by the, quote, private sector. And commensurate with that, property rights, the ability to actually own and operate property, has significantly improved. Final comment, our US policy and our desire to enhance economic reform, I think, should involve very strong support, but not just for Russia, but for the former states of the Soviet Union as well. And support for economic reform, I believe, should involve support for their independence. One or two comments just about with respect to China. I think political change, as I mentioned, has been much slower, and in turn, US policy must take that into account as it deals on a bilateral and multilateral nature with respect to China. It's difficult to see how much progress can be made, at least from my perspective, to achieve a truly market-oriented system within a socialist political system. But if that is the objective, if that is on the horizon for the near term, then we must recognize this as a fundamental dichotomy, if you will, for those of us that have not been willing to experience that and be willing to deal with it. I think that reform within China has certainly occurred on the agricultural sector. I think at the heart of the challenge will be whether or not the country can tackle the major issues on the industrial side of its economy. For example, I would watch very closely the energy sector and see whether or not the same kind of reforms can occur. Finally, I would say that I would be very cautious about distorting U.S. economic policy in order to bring about domestic political change. I think visibly tying our economic policies, such as the granting of MFN, to changes in domestic economic policy historically have been counterproductive, and I think will be in the future. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, as we proceed here, we've got about 45 minutes to go in this particular panel, and we haven't even got through half of the 7 members here. So I am simply pointing out the arithmetic and the inevitability of the clock's movement. Michael Armacost, please.
I'll be very brief. Marvin asked me to speak quickly about some personal experience that relates to this subject, and since most of my time in recent years has been spent with another country, Japan, I can be quite crisp about it. And I was asked in the spring of 1994 to make a confidential mission to Beijing to try and help facilitate the resolution of the most favored nation issue. And it seemed to me that effort, which lay at the nexus of our interest in political and economic reform, was quite instructive, although I believe most of the lessons are negative lessons. Bear in mind that the 10 Commandments has 7 negative injunctions, so this is perhaps par for the course. I think one of the lessons is that if you have a highly public effort to change what another country regards as its internal politics, you're going to complicate rather than simplify the task, particularly in relation to China, a country with a proud, long history, at a time when nationalism is an ideology which transcends all competing ideology. Secondly, we had a highly specific agenda, and with that specific agenda, I think we conveyed an indifference to or inattentiveness to political trends in China which were rather positive. We conveyed an impression that it was regressive and nothing positive was occurring. Yet, as others have said, the degree of personal freedom in China has vastly expanded as prosperity has increased. 100 million people have been relieved of abject poverty, which in human rights terms I think is not insignificant. The atrophy of the Marxist-Leninist ideologies that relates to everyday life, the decentralization of economic planning, making China a more comfortable neighbor. These, I think, are not insignificant political developments, but we conveyed the impression that they were not important to us. Thirdly, we had a very short-term timetable, 1 year, to meet a deadline set by Congress for an executive order. And yet the process of change in a complex society like China, we know, doesn't bend itself to our legislative process. And we neglected the fact that these complex processes of change work themselves out in relation to the uniqueness of an individual culture and require a degree of patience. The fourth, I think we forgot that we're more likely to nurture the marginal influence we have on these issues if we have a larger relationship with the country. I'm reminded in the mid-1980s, when we began developing a thicker set of ties with Russia, it was the fact that we were engaged in a whole series of issues, strategic issues, regional issues, economic issues, bilateral questions, and human rights. We were able to make progress on these delicate political reform issues in the interstices of a broader relationship. I think that's more likely to be productive than making our political ties or our economic ties hostage to internal reforms on a specific timetable in the absence of that broader relationship. And finally, I think we're more likely to be productive on a question of this kind, which is delicate and sensitive, if we utilize multilateral mechanism rather than treating it principally as part of our bilateral relationship. You stop there.
Thank you very much. Peter Rosenblatt, I'm reminded of what Minister Besmertnik said about the importance of the development of small and medium-sized business, and you have been working on that in Russia. Could you share your experience with us?
Thank you very much, Marvin. That is so. I'm very pleased to hear from Minister Besmertnik that he considers small business to be as vital as we who work in this field do. Let me first explain how I come to be in it. I am the president of a fund, a not-for-profit fund, which was established in 1991 by my law partners and me to work in the former Soviet Union, and we chose the field of small business as the most promising and important area. We established a for-profit subsidiary of our not-for-profit fund to be the instrument, and it is funded by the United States government, modestly, but nonetheless, I think rather courageously. It began under the Bush administration, and the funding was completed under the Clinton administration. The question of what hope there is for reform, seen from the worm's eye view, which I here represent, I think brings me to many of the same conclusions as Minister Besmertnik. There has been a great deal of progress. Statistics are unreliable, but one feels it. The evidence is largely anecdotal. But I do believe that the prospects for the future depend very much on the outcome of the elections that are to take place in Russia this winter and next spring. There are, as I see it, three basic problems that are holding up the progress of reform. The first is a lack of law and reliable law enforcement. By lack of law, I mean that there simply isn't law on a lot of subjects which are terribly important to commercial activity. The absence of law enforcement is linked also to a related issue which has been mentioned previously, that of crime and corruption within the bureaucracy. The second problem is the existence in Russia of confiscatory taxes, and by that I mean that it is possible to cite cases of businesses which are asked to pay more than 100% of their profit. And the third is the lack of credit. The lack of credit is closely linked to the lack of law and law enforcement, because those banks and other resources that would otherwise be available for credit for small and even larger business feel that the extension of credit is too risky given the lack of enforcement, debt collection enforcement facilities. Nonetheless, our small business has survived in a rather hostile environment, and we think that it has done so because we have a largely Russian staff, a staff which is able to understand and deal with local conditions much better than, I think, expatriates that man most American businesses in Russia. And secondly, because through our small business lending facility and related small business banker training program, we are able to identify solid banks and work through those banks to select borrowers carefully. Our experience, I think, therefore suggests that it is possible to do business in Russia now, and that with greater stability, hopefully, Minister Besmertnik, coupled with a continuation of progress towards full democracy, but with that stability in the context of democracy, we think that it is quite possible that after these elections, there may very well be a realization of the kind of economic growth which you have suggested, perhaps at the median level, perhaps even at a greater level, depending on the outcome of the elections. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, very much indeed. Robert Zoellick, please.
I'd like to make a point on Russia with an anecdote about a meeting that I took part in with President Yeltsin shortly after he took office. I wanted to convey an idea about political economy as he was considering his reform plans. And so I tried to reach for a Russian example, and I hearkened back to the age of Stalin, who, when he wanted to enforce his system of political economy, made sure that he wiped out the base, the political base, for market economics. And as some of you may know, this in particular took the form of wiping out the kulaks, which, when I learned history, were described as a peasant with a cow. They were a slightly more upgrade category of farmer in Russia. So I said to President Yeltsin, you know, when Stalin wanted to take control, he wanted to get rid of the kulaks. And all of a sudden, this fist came down on the table. And he said he not only wanted to, but he did. And I learned a point there, I guess, about the fine points of the politics of diplomacy, to coin a phrase. But my point to him, and I think it's a point that applies to Russia today, is that economic reform requires a political base. And what I went on to say to President Yeltsin is that he needed a group of people who went and said they had their farm, their home, their truck, their piece of property, their holding in society because of market economics. And some of this has taken place. But one of my concerns for Russia in the future is that free markets and capitalism now have a bad name. They tend to be associated with crime, corruption, not benefiting the general public at large. So I think as we look at Russia in the future, the key will be whether Russia is able to implement a fair rule of law system and whether it is able to stay an open system both for the purpose of economic efficiency but also political identity. Just a quick word on China. China has actually been a classic case of an open-door policy that has succeeded economically. If you look at the flows of capital, technology, trade with China, they've really been extraordinary, and I think they've triggered an internal growth process. At the same time, it is the case that China is in an era of extraordinary political transition. You have the question of the regions in the center that some have mentioned, the role of the Communist Party, civil-military relations, to say nothing of the fact of whether Deng Xiaoping really will be immortal. And the question is whether China will go beyond the economic performance that at this point has substituted for legitimacy. What has happened in China is the good economic times have filled in some of these gaps. But there are problems. There are high expectations, there's corruption, there's the possibility of inflation. So what you see in oversimplified form are two schools developing. One is a neo-authoritarian school that wants to strengthen centralized power, strengthen the role of the military, reinvigorate state enterprises. And then there's one that is striving for the rule of law with pluralism, tolerance, and a more cosmopolitan image. My last point on this is that I think it's very important that the United States first do nothing that strengthens the former school, as I think some of our policies have by playing poorly into internal Chinese politics. But second, as Charles Pohl said, that we emphasize China's engagement with the world through applying a set of rules that require it to play a role that also gives a benefit for the role. And here I have to say I have some sympathy for the Chinese. Within 1 week, they can have USTR at their door criticizing them for market access. They can have the Commerce Department at their door urging foreign investment. They can have the Defense Department trying to develop a military relationship, and they can have the State Department hammering on them on human rights. It's not surprising that they get a little confused about the larger engagement. So while I think the overall policy of comprehensive engagement is a sound one strategically, it's important that we also implement it tactically.
Thanks very much. Professor Dornbusch?
Thank you. Let me pick up some of the themes that are left and working them once over. I would like to disagree a bit with the optimism about Russia that was expressed at the outset, and rather say that Russia is bad news, like finding out your mother-in-law has a twin sister. I think wherever you look in Russia today, extraordinary problems are on hold, and they're very, very close to going as wrong as the Weimar Republic in Germany. The immediate issue is stabilization, with great effort, to the end of the year, Russia is staying within an amended budget and within a money supply rule of the IMF. But that is before elections are taking place, with no expectation that that will continue. But there is a very short fuse from money creation to hyperinflation. Russia has had it twice. There's no expectation that next year we will not, just as in every previous January, have hyperinflation. And if that comes, the number two issue is an extraordinary inequality that has come with the move to the market, that is widening and deepening, and certainly another outburst of hyperinflation will make that much worse. The second issue is reform. Reform is clearly stuck for more than a year. Nothing has happened. The government does not dare to move. Issues like agriculture don't even get into discussion, even though anywhere else, particularly in China, they were the very first step to a market economy. Unless reform comes back, Russia simply isn't going to make it, and at present there is nobody who's moving reform. Lastly, criminalization and inequality are the most obvious signs of the market economy, other than the Mercedeses in front of the Bolshoi Hotel. That is really Russia, and Russia is about to go into elections that are like the Weimar Republic, with a proliferation of eccentric parties and with the strength near the center where people say no reform and let's have some budget cuts and let's have some fun. So Russia then is a very difficult situation. What can the West do about it? Very little, other than to help in that perennial struggle in Russia, whether to be inward-looking, as any large country is tempted to do, or else to help them look outward and modernize. I think that we should immediately forgive the silly little debts that Russia has, so that nobody in the end is going to make out of it the equivalent of reparation payments in Germany. We ought to open free trade completely, unconditionally, so that Russia is drawn to the West simply through trade. That isn't easy, that is very heroic, but of course the alternative of a Russia that explodes is far more expensive. Let me comment on the difference with China. I think that China has none of these dismal prospects, that the economy is doing phenomenally well and pays therefore for the lack of reform, for the huge deficits in the state enterprises, for the continuing statism, that there's no expectation that that changes at all in the near term. The Chinese savings rate is far higher than that in Japan, and that pays for a lot of the damage. And the decentralization de facto in China is going forward in a way that is totally uncontrolled by Beijing. A key aspect of the Chinese economy is that local enterprises are involved in the promotion of the market, and that keeps some lid on inequality. There's plenty in China, but compared to Russia, no way. In China, there is an inborn element of speculation and risk-taking and individualism that goes well into business, and I think that is driving China in a positive direction. That doesn't mean that China is going to be something for us where we don't have to wear safety belts. China is big, China is huge, it's unruly, and China knows it can afford to do just that. I think for us that is a great source of discomfort. I join the earlier speakers to say we have to learn that China is big, it's not going to follow our script, and the more we interact, the less trouble we will get from it, and the more chances we have in building a positive relationship and try to help China move at least part of the way toward the world rulebook. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. One of the large thoughts that I heard from most members of the panel was that economic reform, and let's start first with Russia, is irreversible, and yet, Professor Dornbusch, I thought you were saying toward the end there that there not having been reform in Russia, in your view, in the past year, it probably, or it may not work. Do you mean that it is reversible?
I think the issue is not whether guys are going to run a mom and pop shop. The issue is whether you build a society around the market with rules of the game, or whether you wind up, after hyperinflation, with a very repressive government that practices statism, controls, nationalism, repression. And I think that issue in Russia is the result of the economic disaster that we have had in the past few years, and that is possibly around the corner in January.
Minister Besmertnik, your view, as you summarized your comments, were really quite different from the professor's view. Having heard him now, how could you respond to him?
Well, I don't see that there is a great difference in approach. We just covered different angles of the situation, that's it. When I was saying that Russian situation has been improving lately, I didn't mean that everything is really brilliant in the situation. I was mentioning the trends. If you followed what has been happening since 1991 to 1995, the view was depressing, and nothing was really happening that would give us a reason to say reform works. And when we say now that there are indications the situation is turning for the better, it doesn't mean that all the difficulties has been removed. Agriculture is I agree completely with what you have said. I just didn't mention that. I didn't have time for saying about talking the difficulties. Agriculture is the strategic weakness of Russia, and if we don't solve it, we shall have an enormous problem. But turning to the problem irreversibility or reversibility of the reforms, I'm completely confident that whoever wins in the elections, which you have referred to, the economic reform will go on. Economic reform now fights everyone. It fights the government, which is a non-market market economy oriented. It really squeezes the private sector by enormous taxation. It fights the bureaucracy, I mean the market economy. It fights everyone. It still survives and goes on. So I believe that the market economy will go on. It is being the part of everybody's life now, and I know that. I have been meeting a lot of people lately on the ground. They know that the market economy is a promise, is a hope. The return to the previous time in that sense is impossible. What they want from the past is the social protection. The social protection, good pensions, no unemployment, free medicine, free education, and that's it. But they don't want the economic situation as it was before the reform time.
Now, with respect to China, the issue was not so much about the irreversibility of economic reform, but the link to political reform, and that has come up time and time again. And those who would like to respond to this, please do so. But do you think of political reform as a necessary companion of the dramatic economic progress that China has made, and how much time will it take? Mr. Ambassador, you could answer that first, please.
Let me answer the question in 3 points, briefly. Firstly, China is undergoing economic reform. As I just said, by 1992, we have decided we are going to have a socialist market economy. Over the years, there was a belief that socialist countries can have only planned and centralized economy. Market economy belong only to capitalist countries. Then in China, I think it was the leaders of China who asked the question ourselves, why can't a socialist country can have market economy? And the answer we have is whether it is market economy or centralized economy, planned economy, is just a form of economy. It has nothing to do with the system of of the country. So that's why in 1992 we decided we shall have a socialist system but market economy. That's one point. And we are now, well, in the course of trying, and we don't know whether we of course, we think we will be successful, but it will take a long period of time to prove that our theory is practicable. Second thing is, in the course of Chinese reform, we have two sides. One side is, of course, we are successful in many ways. The other side is we have some problems, as I said, mentioned. For example, agriculture is one problem, inflation is another problem. As somebody mentioned, corruption, which we have taken serious steps to try to do that. And then, of course, the question comes, as you have just mentioned, whether political reform should go hand in hand with economic reform. My answer is we are now having some political reform, and we think with economic reform we are going to have political reform also. But when we say political reform, we don't mean we are going to change our society from a socialist country to be a capitalist country, from socialist society to be a capitalist society. What we do in our political reform is to expand democracy and to perfect our legal system. That's what we are doing.
Mr. Ambassador, a number of people would argue that in the last 5 to 10 years, if recent history means anything, it means that the idea of socialism together with a market economy is oxymoronic. It doesn't work, that one has failed and the other continues to show a great deal of signs of vitality in different parts of the world, and that people are moving in that direction and not towards socialism. But we have a number of participants who'd like to come in. I think Professor Smith and Mr. Parsky.
Yes, I think that the question of the relationship between political and economic change is a very important one. And I think that in the case of the People's Republic of China, one of the questions that constantly emerges in deciding on such issues is the huge size of China and its complexity, which the Chinese see as a special characteristic. And in a certain sense, although there are models out there that do not have the magnitude of the People's Republic, they seem to be useful. One of them, of course, is the issue of Taiwan. One of them is South Korea, and others that are even smaller but still significant are Singapore and Hong Kong. And in Taiwan and South Korea in particular, it is clear that economic change was a prelude to political change, and that those political changes, once a base was established, proceeded quite rapidly. So it seems to me that three critical elements in the more open democratic development of a state is, first of all, the rise of a middle class, secondly, the growth of what is sometimes called civil society, and finally, of course, rule of law. And it does seem that the precedents, albeit smaller in scale, of South Korea and Taiwan bode well for a priority on economic as against purely political reform.
Mr. Parsky and Mr. Zelik.
Just a brief comment, Marvin, to pick up on what you said. Perhaps it's that I don't have the right definition of a socialist system. And that's why I can't quite understand how the maintenance of a socialist system can foster in the long term a market-oriented economy. But if you just ask the basic question, will capital be allocated by a centralized government, or will it be free to be allocated according to the market? If that question is answered in one way, we have a more market-oriented economy. If it's answered in another way, then I think ultimately we won't be in a position to see it.
Thank you very much. Mr. Zelik?
I wanted to pick up on a point that Rudy Dornbush made about Russia that also causes me some anxiety, and that is, I think this is a change from the past. Economic security no longer depends on massing resources like territory or natural resources or military domination. These were the coin of the realm in the 18th and 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. To an increasing degree, strength depends on openness for competition and ideas. And ironically, it also depends on strong neighbors, not weak neighbors. And this is a point that is probably particularly felt in this city when you consider our relationship with Mexico. And as I look at Russia's policies with its neighbors, I think this will be a big area of concern. If it takes the traditional 19th century approach, whether it be towards Ukraine or towards the countries on the southern tier, then I think it may try to dominate them and perpetuate weakness. If, on the other hand, it recognizes, as Western Europe has, that countries next to each other do better if they are growing and strong together, then I think it has a better chance both to stay open and to be successful with economic reform.
it seems to me, Minister Besmertnik, that when you and I were talking last night, you would share that concern about the rise of a 19th century imperialistic view impeding the development of economic and political reform. Is that right?
You see, it's a very complicated issue, really, because when Russia tries to reestablish economic and political relationship with the former republics of the Soviet Union, many people immediately suspect that this is an imperial attempt to reconstruct the empire. I must say that there are many people in Russia who would like to do that. And there are many people in the politics who are actually pushing themselves to the power just by insisting on the possibility of it. But when I said it's a difficult phenomenon, I would like to mention just one thing. Russia is still subsidizing, basically, the CIS countries. They owe us $9 billion. This is exactly the sum of money which we request from the World Bank and International Monetary Fund to give to Russia to sustain its own economy. So if it were not for the Russian participation in economic life of those countries, their future and their present situation would be much more miserable. So Russia is still behaving in that sense as a central part of the whole territory. As for the imperial ambitions, I don't think that many Russians are interested actually now in reconstructing an empire because we have a lot of problems for our own people. When the Soviet Union dismembered, we have lost half of the population, but only a periphery in a territorial sense. So with 150 million people, Russia has a lot of things to do, and I think the view that the Russians should do something more for themselves is gaining more and more power in the public opinion. I see the developments in the following way. Economic relationship would be getting closer and closer. Political relationship would have a lot of difficulties for the future, especially we shall have problems with Ukraine. As for the defense and the military issues of the future, I think they would lie somewhere behind this century.
Thank you very much. Peter Rosenblatt and Sir Charles.
I think we ought not to be caught up too much on terminology. Russia is said to have made the transition from its former system to one which is in some respects democratic. It is at least representative, and that is true. In fact, economic life in Russia teeters somewhere between the old bureaucratic system and chaos. China, on the other hand, says that it has not made any change in its fundamental system, and yet economic life is free to an extraordinary extent in China. I think that the basic principle upon which we operate in this country, that economic prosperity is linked to a maximum degree of freedom, may in fact be in the process of being proved out.
Thank you, Peter, very much. Sir Charles.
On the subject of political change in China, I was only going to point out, rather unhelpfully no doubt, that our record of prediction of political change in other countries is quite extraordinarily bad. We had no notion that communism was going to collapse anything like as quickly as it did in the Soviet Union. In China's case, it does seem to me there are models in Asia of countries which evolved from fairly strongly centralized authoritarian political rule presiding over extensive economic reform and then gradually democratize. One's seen it in Korea and Taiwan, to a degree to Singapore. I don't see any inherent reason why one shouldn't expect China to follow the same path. But secondly, on the question of prediction, this time in relation to Russia, time and again since the 80s, we've heard predictions of impending catastrophe in Russia. Every winter was going to bring famine and starvation. Every summer was going to bring massive social unrest. But actually, it hasn't happened. And I don't think there's any inherent reason to believe that it will happen. I think reform, economic reform, is deeply entrenched now in Russia. And I think it will survive. It'll be nail-biting for the rest of us. It'll be like watching a man walking a tightrope across the Niagara Falls, but he's going to get to the other side.
Thank you, sir. Michael Armacost.
I share Charles' skepticism about our ability to fathom the dynamics which shape some of these other societies. And also, we tend to exaggerate our capacity to exert a decisive influence on these things. But it's at least worth examining who is positioned to exert greater influence. And to take the Chinese case, I don't think anybody's mentioned the nexus between China and the overseas Chinese, which represented a quite unique asset for them relative to the experience in Russia. For here is a group of extraordinarily successful people in countries adjacent to China who have been responsible, I believe, for about 70% of all the investment that has come into China in recent years. Now, it happens that many of those countries come from an experience of going through these political transitions themselves. They don't, however, offer the kind of advice we have been offering. I believe it's important for us to be deeply engaged in China. The opportunity to be there arises out of the fact that they have invited Western investment, particularly in sectors related to infrastructure, telecommunications, energy, transportation, things that we're good at. And to at least be engaged gives us a greater capacity to fathom what's going on and, again, on the margins, to at least have some voice in it.
Thank you, Mike. A number of you have sent questions up here, and they're very good questions, and I'd like to ask some of them of our panel. And the first is, what specifically can the West do to help reform in Russia? And who would like to start on that? Peter, what specifically can the West do?
Well, I think probably one word would express it: more. We have said we've played a very impressive game in talking about how much we support this process in Russia. We have done remarkably little. But I think there's also a qualitative issue. We need to be more selective in the ways in which we attempt to influence the course of events in Russia, which in any event is difficult. I do believe that the economy is the key, and the degree of our economic assistance is linked in large measure to the political situation. And this is really the reason which I suggested earlier in my remarks, that very much depends upon the outcome of the forthcoming elections. If there emerges in Russia from these elections a degree of stability and continued progress towards democracy and liberalization of the economic system, I think that the West should take another look at the forms of economic assistance that it continues to have the ability to deliver.
One of you said, and I don't want to go through my notes now and find the exact person, but you'll know it, that there's very little that the West can really do, that this is a problem primarily for Russia. And so there's another question that comes up. Let us assume that the West were to do the most brilliant job in the world and fine-tune the aid. Is it still ultimately the responsibility of Russia, and to what degree is Western aid going to make any significant difference? Minister?
Well, first of all, the Russian reform is the Russian business, and this is for the Russians to do it. When we are talking about the role of the outside world, this is just the role of a supportive actor, not the main actor on the scene. And the West should not try to put itself in the category of the main actor on the Russian scene. But talking about the specific actions that the outside world could make, I would mention, besides what I have already said, first is to renounce some remnants of the Cold War attitude of viewing Russia as a potential opponent, as a country that could create a danger in the future, etc. I think it would be better to follow the line which Secretary Baker just mentioned, the line that the economy becomes global, and Russia should become an integral part of globalization of economic life in Russia. As for the even more specific things, I would say that what Russia needs is good investments, with not so much credits, but investments. So investments may come to the Russian economy, become a part of it, warm it up, and then develops itself within the Russian economic system, which is pretty possible. And third is very important that the political framework in which the economic development occurs should not be overwhelmingly important, should not be exaggerated by policymakers in Washington. For example, when people say, we shall see what would be the results of the elections in December, and then we should either change our mind or go on with supporting Russia. I don't think that should be the basic requirement for changing the attitude. First of all, the December elections are parliamentary elections. Even if the left groups take over it, it's still incapable to change the course of economic reforms in Russia. And even the communists, who are now very active and may have a lot of chances, they are different ones from what we had before. This is the social democratic movement, basically. So I just want to, for the people outside Russia, to keep in mind that we should not hang the future of the country on some particular changes in the political things. They are developing very fast. They are changing. If we have bad results in December, we may have good results in June when we have presidential elections. So things are not so desperate, and the West should not allow Russia to be isolated. This is one of the biggest challenges of the foreign policy of the world at the end of the century.
Professor Dornbusch?
I agree that the West should make sure that there is support for the internationalist part of Russia. I believe the strategy may have been wrong in trying to babysit Russia at the IMF and try and give $1 for every little bit that we want to see. I think it's a much better strategy to put on the table free trade and complete debt relief and say you're by yourself and make the maximum and we're here to help you, rather than this steady haggling with IMF missions that may well fail and will get blamed in the end for it. So let's change strategy, let's play bigger and make Russia far more responsible for itself.
Bob Zoellick, and then I would like to ask Prime Minister Takeshita if he had some observations he would like to make about our discussion thus far. Bob?
I just wanted to say that your question actually reminds me of a point that both President Bush and Secretary Baker made about the United States and the world. This is going to be a very difficult time for us because we're a country that likes to solve problems. We want to get in there and say, how can we fix this? And particularly with Russia, I think there was initially almost a romantic sense of the possibilities. And now we have to make sure we don't flip to the other side of resignation. We have to be realistic about the possibilities. And this also is true with China, as Sir Charles Powell mentioned, is that we're going to have to be engaged in this for the long haul, and to set our goal on sort of one issue at a time, expect to get it solved, is going to be bound to disappoint us, and we need to see these in the larger context.
Prime Minister Takeshita, would you like to comment, sir?
With regards to the Russian issue, we, the finance ministers, were meeting together at G5, and then it grew into G7. And right now, G7 plus 1, and this 1 is the Russia. And we probably need to increase the frequency of this G7 plus 1 by Russia bringing in on its own various issues to the table. With regards to China, I do visit China every year, and I have been amazed on each trip. In fact, about 2 weeks ago, regarding the yen loan, 144 billion yen. This is the last portion of the third yen loan of 810 billion yen. What I am impressed about this yen loan is that it is truly various projects are carried out as scheduled. It is quite amazing that regardless of the nature of the project, may it be the dam or the construction of a bridge, it is completed within its scheduled time. Now, from now on, the environment has to be put together under which more of a private sector investment could become possible. And I hope perhaps Baker Institute could sponsor some sort of a symposium put together with some Chinese universities. I think that is one possible way to tackle with an issue like that.
Thank you very much, sir. That's a good idea.
It's a very good idea.
Have to work on that, too. The tyranny of the clock is such that we are out of time for our first panel, but I did want to thank our panelists for their most informative discussion of this issue of economic reform in Russia and in China.